2,484 Soviet women were trained as snipers during the Second World War. Only about 500 survived. That is an 80% casualty rate, one of the highest of any specialized military unit in the entire conflict. Among those who lived was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a young history student turned sniper with 309 confirmed kills, making her the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. This is not a story of symbolic participation or token representation. This is a story of women who became some of the most effective killers on the Eastern Front, who paralyzed German units with fear, who hunted men across ruined cities and frozen fields, and who were then systematically betrayed, erased, and forgotten by the very state they served. This documentary draws on primary sources including combat diaries, Soviet military archives, German battlefield reports, and academic research from institutions including the National World War II Museum, the State University of New York at Buffalo State, and the University of East Anglia. The central question we will answer is this: were these women a decisive, lethal force whose contributions were later betrayed and erased by the very state they served? The evidence will show the answer is unequivocally yes. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa begins. 3 million German troops crash across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. The initial onslaught is catastrophic beyond comprehension. According to historian David Glantz, within the first 3 weeks, the Red Army loses over 2 million men killed, wounded, or captured. Entire army groups are encircled and annihilated. The Wehrmacht advances up to 400 miles into Soviet territory in some sectors. By December 1941, Soviet casualties exceed 4.5 million. The Red Army is bleeding to death. According to research published by Buffalo State College in their thesis on experiences of Soviet women combatants, by late 1941, the Soviet Union faced a manpower crisis so severe that traditional gender barriers in military service became expendable luxuries the state could no longer afford. Women had served in support roles as medics and communication specialists, but frontline combat remained exclusively male. That changed when survival itself was at stake. Stalin and the Soviet High Command faced a brutal calculation. Millions of men were dead or captured. Millions more were needed to hold the line. The state propaganda machine had spent 2 decades promoting gender equality and the heroic Soviet woman. Now that rhetoric would be tested in blood. In May 1943, the Central Women's Sniper Training School was formally established near the village of Podolsk, not far from Moscow, although women snipers had been deployed in smaller numbers since 1941. According to the Wikipedia entry for the Central Women's Sniper Training School, citing Soviet military archives, this facility would train over 1,500 female snipers during the war, with additional training conducted at other facilities, bringing the total to approximately 2,484. The decision was not sentimental. Soviet military doctrine recognized sniping as a force multiplier requiring patience, precision, and the ability to remain motionless for hours. These were qualities military planners believed women could match or exceed compared to male soldiers. But make no mistake, this was not liberation. This was mobilization born of desperation. The training itself was brutal beyond what most modern listeners would consider acceptable. According to the Buffalo State thesis, citing interviews with surviving snipers, recruits were subjected to a regimen designed not just to teach marksmanship, but to break down civilian psychology and rebuild it for killing. The course lasted between 6 months and 1 year depending on wartime urgency. Trainees learned to fire the Mosin-Nagant rifle, the standard Soviet sniper weapon, achieving accuracy within a 4-inch circle at distances up to 800 meters. But technical skill was only the beginning. Recruits spent days lying in snow or mud in full camouflage, learning to control breathing, heartbeat, even bladder function to avoid movement. They were taught to read terrain and wind, to calculate bullet drop and drift, to identify targets by uniform insignia and behavior patterns. Officers were priority targets, machine gunners, forward observers, anyone whose death would disrupt enemy operations. Psychological conditioning was equally critical. According to historian Lyuba Vinogradova, quoted in multiple sources including the Warfare History Network article on Rosa Shanina and the Soviet women snipers of World War II, Instructors used dehumanization techniques to help young women overcome the natural resistance to killing. Targets were not men. They were fascists, invaders, occupiers. Instructors showed photographs of atrocities committed by German forces against Soviet civilians. They invoked the defense of the motherland, family, the socialist state. Some recruits needed little convincing. Many had seen their villages burned, their families killed or displaced. Others struggled. Training records indicate a significant washout rate, not from lack of skill but from psychological inability to internalize the role of killer. Who were these women? The stereotype might suggest desperate peasants with no alternatives. The reality, according to multiple sources, was strikingly different. Many recruits were educated, urban, and voluntary. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was a history student at Kiev University. Rosa Shanina had completed teacher training and dreamed of studying literature. According to the National World War II Museum article on Pavlichenko, she joined a sniper club while still in school, learning marksmanship as a competitive sport before the war. When the invasion came, she tried to enlist as a rifleman. A recruiter looked at her and laughed. She mentioned her marksmanship scores. He gave her a rifle and a test. She passed. She was sent to the front. Many women faced similar skepticism, and many responded by exceeding expectations. Others were motivated by vengeance. Rosa Shanina's brother was killed early in the war. Her diary, quoted extensively in the Warfare History Network article, reveals a young woman driven by grief transformed into lethal focus. Importantly, most of these women rejected safer roles. According to the Buffalo State Thesis, military administrators offered trained women positions as instructors, keeping them away from the front. Many refused. They had not endured months of grueling training to teach. They had trained to fight. This was not coercion. This was agency exercised in the context of total war. That agency would later be questioned, minimized, and erased, but the documentary record is clear. These women chose the front. Now we turn to combat effectiveness. Were these women actually lethal, or were they propaganda constructs? The evidence is overwhelming. According to Soviet military records cited by the National World War II Museum, Lyudmila Pavlichenko achieved 309 confirmed kills between August 1941 and June 1942, operating primarily around Odessa and Sevastopol. Confirmed kills in Soviet doctrine required verification by a spotter or recovery of enemy identification. This was not self-reporting. This was documented lethality. Her targets included 36 enemy snipers, meaning she was hunting the hunters, eliminating trained German marksmen in counter-sniper duels. Rosa Shanina, according to the Warfare History Network, achieved 59 confirmed kills and was one of the first Soviet snipers trained in the technique of shooting moving targets, a skill requiring extraordinary reflexes and calculation. These numbers represent not just individual lethality but operational impact. A sniper does not hold ground or capture objectives in the traditional sense. A sniper disrupts, demoralizes, and paralyses. According to German battlefield reports cited in multiple secondary sources, units operating in sectors with active Soviet snipers experienced significant psychological deterioration. Officers stopped wearing insignia. Soldiers refused to move during daylight. Routine activities like retrieving water or visiting latrines became life-threatening gambles. The presence of a single skilled sniper could effectively suppress an entire company. When that sniper was a woman, German propaganda worked overtime to dismiss the threat, but battlefield reality told a different story. Fear does not respect gender. Consider the Siege of Sevastopol, one of the longest and bloodiest sieges of the war, lasting from October 1941 to July 1942. According to the National World War II Museum, Pavlichenko operated throughout this siege, targeting German and Romanian officers and machine gun crews. The city was under constant artillery bombardment. Snipers worked in rubble and ruins, often isolated, always exposed to counter-battery fire and counter-snipers. Pavlichenko later described lying in position for up to 20 hours waiting for a single shot. She described the cold, the hunger, the fear, and the absolute focus required to function. She survived the siege and was evacuated before the final collapse. Many of her fellow snipers did not. Rosa Shanina fought primarily in the Baltic and East Prussia campaigns from 1943 to 1945. According to her diary entries quoted in the Warfare History Network article, she wrote about the emotional toll of killing, the nightmares, the way faces of dead men haunted her sleep. But she also wrote about duty, about her brother, about the friends she lost. In January 1945, she volunteered for a dangerous reconnaissance mission despite being wounded days earlier. She was hit by shell fragments while shielding a wounded comrade. She died the next day, January 28, 1945, at age 20. She was awarded the Order of Glory, but her diary was suppressed for decades because it contained criticisms of Soviet military leadership and expressions of doubt about the war's conduct. This brings us to the nature of the hunt itself. Modern warfare is often distant, mechanized, anonymous. Sniping is intimate. You see your target's face. You watch their movements, their habits. You learn to predict their behavior. Then you kill them from a distance where they never see you. This is not combat as most people imagine it. This is hunting humans. According to the Buffalo State thesis, which includes translated excerpts from sniper memoirs, many women described a dissociative psychological state necessary to function. One sniper, name redacted in the source, described seeing her targets as moving objects rather than people. Another described praying before each shot, not for forgiveness but for accuracy. The psychological cost was immense. Post-traumatic stress was not widely recognized or treated in the Soviet military, and women snipers carried these experiences for the rest of their lives, often in silence. Let me take you inside a sniper duel, reconstructed from multiple accounts. Imagine a ruined apartment block in Stalingrad, third floor, corner room, southern exposure. A Soviet sniper, let us call her Anna, has been in position since before dawn. She is wrapped in a white camouflage sheet, lying behind a pile of rubble, rifle braced on a broken beam. Her spotter is 2 meters to her left, scanning the German lines through binoculars. It is winter. The temperature is 20 below zero. Anna has been motionless for 6 hours. Movement means death. Across the rubble field, approximately 400 meters away, is another ruined building. German positions. Anna knows there is a sniper there. Yesterday, he killed a Soviet lieutenant. The day before, a radio operator. Anna has been sent to eliminate him. The spotter whispers, movement. Second floor, left window. Anna shifts her eye to the scope, a slow, smooth motion taking 30 seconds. She scans the window. Nothing. She waits. Minutes pass. Then a glint. Sunlight reflecting off glass. The German sniper is scanning with binoculars. Anna does not move. She knows he is looking for her. If he sees the slightest irregularity, a shape that does not match the rubble, he will fire. She controls her breathing, shallow, slow. Her heartbeat is audible in her ears. The glint disappears. The German has moved back from the window. He is cautious. Trained, this will not be easy. Anna and her spotter wait. An hour passes, 2 hours. The cold is agonizing. Anna's fingers are numb. She cannot afford to shiver. Movement is death. Then the German makes a mistake. A figure moves behind a different window. The German is repositioning, trying to get a different angle. But for 5 seconds, his silhouette is visible against the lighter interior of the room. Anna does not hesitate. She exhales halfway, holds it, and squeezes the trigger. The Mosin Nagant kicks against her shoulder. The report echoes across the rubble. Through the scope, she sees the figure jerk and fall. The spotter confirms the hit. Anna and the spotter immediately displace, moving to a different position before German artillery can range their location. 2 minutes later, shells begin falling on the building they just left. That is a successful engagement. 1 enemy sniper dead, 2 Soviet snipers alive. For now. This was the reality of the sniper's war. Hours of frozen immobility punctuated by seconds of violence. The intimacy of watching a human being through a scope, seeing their face, their gestures, then ending them. According to diary entries and memoirs cited in the Buffalo State thesis, many women snipers described this work as both addictive and spiritually corrosive. The skills required, the focus, the sense of efficacy became a source of pride. But the act of killing, repeated dozens or hundreds of times, left scars no metal could heal. Now we turn to what happened when these women were captured. The laws of war, even such as they were under Nazi ideology, did not extend to Soviet women snipers. According to German military correspondence cited in multiple historical sources, including the University of East Anglia paper on Soviet servicewomen and memory, standing orders among many Wehrmacht and SS units specified that female snipers were not to be taken prisoner. They were to be killed on capture, often after interrogation and torture. The case of Duzha Filipova is documented and representative. Filipova was a sniper captured near Leningrad in early 1942. According to testimony collected after the war, cited in the UEA paper, she was tortured for information, then executed. Her body was left displayed as a warning. This was not an isolated incident. The ideological roots of this brutality are clear. Nazi ideology categorized Slavic peoples as subhuman, and women who took up arms violated every tenet of the regime's gender ideology. A woman with a rifle was not just an enemy combatant. She was an ontological threat to the Nazi worldview. German propaganda alternated between mocking Soviet women fighters as masculine aberrations and expressing visceral hatred toward them. Battlefield reports describe Soviet women fighters as ferocious, fanatical, refusing to surrender. This was often true. Surrender meant torture and death. Fighting to the end offered at least the possibility of taking more enemies with you. According to the Buffalo State Thesis, Soviet military intelligence was aware of these atrocities. Orders were issued reminding snipers to avoid capture at all costs. Many women carried an extra grenade, not for the enemy but for themselves. The mathematics were clear. Capture by German forces meant prolonged suffering and certain death. A grenade meant control over the manner and timing of the end. Some chose that option. Others fought until they were killed. Very few were captured alive, and those who were rarely survived. But the cruelty these women faced was not limited to the enemy. Within Soviet ranks, female snipers encountered skepticism, harassment, and coercion that constituted a second front. According to the University of East Anglia paper, which draws on interviews with Soviet women veterans conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, women in frontline units were subjected to pervasive sexual harassment and pressure to become what the paper describes as officer wives, euphemistic relationships that ranged from coerced partnerships to outright sexual exploitation. Women who refused faced retaliation, punitive reassignments, denial of recognition, whispered reputations as difficult or uncooperative. The Soviet state's official ideology promoted gender equality, but military culture remained deeply patriarchal. According to the Buffalo State Thesis, many male officers viewed women soldiers as inherently inferior, distractions, or sexual resources. Women snipers, because of their specialized role and often higher kill counts than male counterparts, provoked particular resentment. Some male snipers refused to work with women. Others spread rumors questioning their competence or implying their success was exaggerated for propaganda purposes. The documentary evidence contradicts these claims. The women's kill counts were confirmed by the same verification processes applied to male snipers. But the rumors persisted. Women who resisted sexual advances or refused coercive relationships often found themselves isolated. According to survivor testimony cited in the UEA paper, some women were transferred out of sniper units into line infantry roles, effectively a death sentence given the casualty rates in regular combat. Others were denied recommendations for decorations despite meeting the criteria. The Soviet state celebrated a handful of women snipers like Pavlichenko for propaganda purposes, sending them on speaking tour and featuring them in newsreels. But the vast majority labored in obscurity, their contributions minimized or ignored by their own command structure. This internal betrayal was compounded by contradictory messaging. The state needed women's service and publicized their heroism when it suited propaganda goals. But it also reinforced traditional gender roles, emphasizing that women's primary duty was motherhood and domesticity. According to the UEA paper, this contradiction created intense psychological pressure. Women were simultaneously told they were heroic defenders of the motherland and unnatural aberrations for taking up arms. This cognitive dissonance followed them into combat and beyond. The end of the war in May 1945 brought not celebration for most surviving women snipers, but erasure. According to the University of East Anglia paper, Soviet post-war culture engaged in a systematic minimization of women's frontline service. State media emphasized women's roles as nurses and support personnel, positions that aligned with traditional gender norms. Women who had served as snipers, tankers, pilots, or infantry were encouraged to return to domestic roles and discouraged from discussing their wartime service. According to survivor interviews, many women veterans were told explicitly that their combat experience made them unmarriageable, that Soviet men wanted wives, not soldiers. The numbers tell the story. Of the approximately 2,484 women trained as snipers, only around 500 survived the war, an 80% casualty rate. Of those survivors, very few received the recognition commensurate with their service. According to the National World War II Museum, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was one of the exceptions. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor. She was sent on a speaking tour to the United States and Canada in 1942, where she met Eleanor Roosevelt and spoke to packed audiences about the Soviet war effort. Her fame was useful to the state, and so she was celebrated. But even Pavlichenko faced post-war marginalization. She was assigned to train snipers but was never again given a frontline command. Her memoirs, published in the Soviet Union, were heavily edited to conform to state narratives. The full, unvarnished account of her experiences was not published in her lifetime. Rosa Shanina, whose diary revealed a complex, conflicted, deeply human response to war, was effectively erased. According to the Warfare History Network, her diary was confiscated after her death and not published in full until the 2000s. Why? Because it contained criticisms of Soviet commanders, expressions of doubt about tactics, and personal reflections that did not fit the heroic narrative the state demanded. She was awarded the Order of Glory, but her story was buried for 60 years. She became a footnote when she should have been remembered as representative of thousands of women who served, suffered, and died. The broader pattern, documented extensively in the UEA paper, shows that Soviet post-war culture constructed a memory of the Great Patriotic War that centered male combatants and relegated women to supporting roles. Women veterans were stigmatized. Many hid their service. Job applications asked about military service, and women who disclosed combat roles were often rejected. Employers assumed they were psychologically damaged, masculine, or otherwise unfit for civilian life. Some women were denied access to higher education. Others were excluded from veterans' organizations. The state that had mobilized them, trained them, and sent them to die by the thousands now preferred they simply disappear. This erasure was not accidental. It reflected deep anxieties about gender, the nature of Soviet society, and the war itself. The Great Patriotic War was mythologized as a sacred, redemptive struggle. Women with rifles, women who killed hundreds of men, women who survived brutal combat and refused to be silent about it, complicated that narrative. They raised uncomfortable questions. If women could be effective soldiers, what did that say about traditional gender roles? If the state had to mobilize women for frontline combat, what did that say about Soviet military competence? If women veterans returned traumatized and broken, what did that say about the war's cost? It was easier to erase them than to answer those questions. According to the Buffalo State thesis, psychological trauma among surviving women snipers was pervasive and largely untreated. The Soviet military did not recognize what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Women who exhibited symptoms, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness were dismissed as weak or hysterical. Support networks were minimal. Many women retreated into silence, isolating themselves from families who could not understand what they had experienced. Some turned to alcohol. Suicide rates among women veterans were significantly higher than among the general population, though precise statistics are difficult to obtain because the Soviet state did not systematically track this data. Or if it did, those records remain classified or lost. Interviews conducted decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, reveal the depth of this trauma. One former sniper, interviewed in the 1990s and cited in the UEA paper, described 50 years of nightmares in which she saw the faces of men she had killed. Another described an inability to form intimate relationships because she could not reconcile her identity as a mother and wife with her identity as someone who had taken hundreds of lives. These women carried the war inside them for the rest of their lives, and the state that had created them offered no help, no recognition, and no gratitude. The contrast between the few celebrated figures and the forgotten majority is stark and deliberate. Lyudmila Pavlichenko became internationally famous. Her image was used on Soviet postage stamps. She was featured in books and films, but even her story was sanitized. The complexity, the trauma, the moral ambiguity of killing were erased in favor of a simple, heroic narrative. The state wanted symbols, not humans. And if Pavlichenko, the most famous woman sniper in history, was reduced to a propaganda tool, What hope did the others have? Most had none. Their names are not on monuments. Their kill counts are not taught in schools. Their sacrifices are not commemorated. They were used when needed and discarded when inconvenient. This is the ultimate betrayal. So we return to the central question. Were these women a decisive, lethal force whose contributions were later betrayed and erased by the very state they served? The evidence is unambiguous. Yes. Soviet women snipers were tactically effective, inflicting significant casualties and psychological damage on German forces. Their kill counts, verified by the same standards applied to male snipers, demonstrate lethality on par with or exceeding many male counterparts. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's 309 confirmed kills, Rosa Shanina's 59 confirmed kills, and the collective toll inflicted by thousands of women snipers represented a meaningful contribution to the Soviet war effort. They were not symbolic, they were lethal. And yes, they were betrayed on the battlefield by commanders who subjected them to harassment and coercion, betrayed by an enemy that refused them the protections of the laws of war, betrayed after the war by a state that erased their service, denied them recognition, and left them to suffer psychological trauma in silence. Of 2,484 women trained as snipers, approximately 500 survived. That 80% casualty rate is among the highest of any specialized unit in the war. And those who survived were given not gratitude but stigma, not support but erasure. This story matters today. It matters because the contributions of women in war continue to be minimized and forgotten. It matters because the psychological costs of combat are still inadequately addressed, particularly for women veterans. It matters because the pattern of mobilization followed by abandonment repeats across conflicts and nations. The Soviet women snipers are not a historical curiosity. They are a warning. States that mobilize women for combat have an obligation to recognize their service, support their reintegration, and honor their sacrifices. The Soviet Union failed that obligation catastrophically. Other nations must learn from that failure. It also matters because these women's stories, told honestly, challenge simplistic narratives about war, gender, and heroism. These were not saints. They were killers, highly effective ones. They were also victims of the war, of the enemy, and of their own state. They were human beings placed in impossible situations who responded with courage, skill, and endurance. Their stories are not comfortable. They do not offer easy moral lessons. They are complicated, ambiguous, and deeply tragic. That is precisely why they must be told. Remembering these women means more than listing names and kill counts. It means grappling with the full reality of their experience, the violence they inflicted, the violence inflicted upon them, the physical and psychological costs they bore, the betrayal they suffered. We honor them not by sanitizing their stories, but by telling them truthfully. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was not Lady Death, a propagandistic caricature. She was a 25-year-old history student who became one of the most lethal snipers in history and spent the rest of her life living with that reality. Rosa Shanina was not a heroic martyr. She was a 20-year-old woman who wanted to study literature, who killed 59 men, who wrote about her nightmares and doubts, and who died shielding a wounded comrade because that was the only choice she had left. The forgotten majority, the names we do not know, the women who died in the rubble of Stalingrad and the forests of Byelorussia and the streets of Berlin, deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals who made impossible choices in the face of existential threat. They deserve recognition not because they were women, which made their service remarkable in the context of their time, but because they were soldiers who performed their duty with exceptional skill under horrific conditions. They deserve acknowledgement of the betrayal they suffered, the erasure inflicted upon them, and the debt owed to them by history. Never again should a state mobilize citizens for total war and then abandon them. Never again should combatants, regardless of gender, be denied the recognition and support they have earned. Never again should the contributions of those who do not fit convenient narratives be erased from the historical record. These are not abstract principles. They are lessons written in the blood of 2,484 women, 80% of whom never came home. This documentary has drawn on research and primary sources from the National World War II Museum article on Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the State University of New York at Buffalo State thesis titled Experiences of Soviet Women Combatants, the Warfare History Network article on Rosa Shanina, and the Soviet women snipers of World War II. The Wikipedia entry for the Central Women's Sniper Training School, citing Soviet military archives, and the University of East Anglia paper on Soviet servicewomen and memory. These sources, along with survivor testimony, military records, and contemporary accounts, provide the evidential